So how long have you been lying, Mr. Hayes? Reporter Claire Whitmore shoved a microphone toward an 84-year-old veteran standing outside a small memorial hall in Virginia. Cameras rolled. Thousands watched live. No military records. No public citations. No proof. Yet this town treats you like a hero. The old man, Walter Hayes, didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply held a small wreath in one hand and looked past the cameras. Claire smirked. That's what I thought. The crowd began whispering. Some nodded. Others pulled out phones. Then Claire spotted a worn silver coin inside Walter's old leather wallet. She held up a photo of it for the live stream. This, she laughed. Is this supposed to convince people you were some secret war hero? For the first time, Walter's eyes shifted toward her. His voice was quiet. Don't call it that. Claire grinned. Why? Because it's fake? The audience online exploded with comments. Fraud. Stolen valor. Exposed. But behind the camera, something changed. Ben Lawson, the young cameraman, zoomed in on the coin. 3 faded letters were scratched into the metal. G. L. -7. His stomach dropped. Years ago, his father had told him a story. If you ever hear the words Gray Lantern, stop talking and start listening. Ben stepped away and made a phone call. Then another. A retired colonel answered. 10 minutes later, that colonel called someone else. Somewhere inside the Pentagon, a name moved across a desk. Walter Hayes. Gray Lantern. Suddenly, a secure meeting stopped cold. A 4-star general stood up, so fast his chair nearly hit the wall. Back at the memorial hall, Claire pressed harder. Last chance, Mr. Hayes. Tell everyone the truth. Walter remained silent. Then Claire's phone rang. Unknown government number. Smiling for the camera, she put it on speaker. Claire Whitmore speaking. The crowd listened. The live stream comments froze. A calm voice answered. This is General Robert McAllister from the Department of Defense. Claire's smile vanished. The general continued. Ma'am, do you still have Walter Hayes standing in front of you? The crowd went silent. Walter slowly lowered his eyes toward the coin. Then the general said 7 words that changed everything. He saved my father's life overseas. And what he revealed next was something the Pentagon had kept hidden for over 50 years. So how long have you been lying, Mr. Hayes? The question sliced through the cool October air before anyone even saw the man it was aimed at. Cameras pivoted. Phones lifted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Outside the Millbrook Veterans Memorial Hall, beneath a sky the color of brushed steel, 84-year-old Walter Hayes stood perfectly still with a small wreath resting in his weathered hands. He looked less like a local celebrity and more like a man who had taken a wrong turn on his way to church. His brown jacket was faded at the elbows. His gray hair moved gently in the breeze. Nothing about him seemed remarkable. That was exactly why Claire Whitmore smiled. Claire was 31, ambitious, and 6 months away from the biggest promotion of her career if she could land the right story. Her live broadcast camera was already streaming to thousands of viewers. A bright red light blinked beside the lens. The comments were moving so fast they were impossible to read. For years, Claire announced confidently, turning toward the audience watching online. This town has treated Walter Hayes like a forgotten American hero. But after weeks of research, I couldn't find the evidence. Murmurs spread through the crowd gathering near the memorial entrance. A few people exchanged uneasy looks. Walter didn't react. He simply kept his eyes on the bronze wall behind the reporter, where dozens of engraved names reflected the pale afternoon sunlight. Claire took a step closer. No public records. No published citations. No interviews. No military history that matches the stories people keep repeating. She paused for effect. So I have to ask again. Were you telling the truth all these years? The silence that followed felt strangely heavy. Not uncomfortable. Not nervous. Heavy. Like something resting beneath the surface of a calm lake. Walter finally looked at her. His eyes were pale blue, steady, and unreadable. There was no anger in them. No embarrassment. No fear. I'm here for the memorial, he said quietly. That's all. Claire laughed softly. The sound carried farther than she intended. Convenient answer. A few people in the crowd shifted uneasily. Others nodded in agreement. The livestream numbers continued climbing. Walter glanced toward the memorial doors. Families were arriving. Veterans in old service caps walked slowly up the stone pathway. An American flag stirred overhead. Yet the old man made no effort to escape the attention. He simply stood there as if he had all the time in the world. Claire noticed the worn leather wallet protruding slightly from his jacket pocket. As she leaned forward, something metallic caught the sunlight for the briefest moment. Her eyes narrowed. "What's that?" she asked. Walter's hand instinctively moved toward the pocket. Just for a second, barely noticeable, but Claire saw it, and the tiny reaction told her something. The reporter's smile widened. For the first time that afternoon, she believed she had found the crack she was looking for. She had no idea that the small object hidden inside that old wallet was about to change everything. Claire Whitmore had learned long ago that silence often meant guilt. That was why Walter Hayes bothered her. Guilty people explained themselves. They argued. They defended their stories. They searched desperately for the right words. Walter Hayes did none of those things. He simply stood beneath the fluttering American flag and held the wreath against his chest as though the entire spectacle unfolding around him belonged to somebody else. The autumn wind swept dry leaves across the stone walkway. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang the quarter hour. Families continued arriving at the memorial hall, but many slowed their steps when they saw the cameras. Some stopped completely. The live stream had become the center of attention. Claire noticed it immediately. The crowd was growing. So were the viewer numbers. She could feel momentum building. This was exactly how major stories started. One small contradiction. One unanswered question. One detail nobody else had bothered to investigate. Her gaze returned to the worn leather wallet. The edge of a dull silver object was still visible inside. Walter had shifted the wallet deeper into his pocket, but not before she had seen it. The movement had been subtle, protective, instinctive, like a man shielding something valuable. Claire pointed toward his jacket. "What are you hiding in there?" she asked. Several people turned toward Walter. Phones rose higher. The old veteran looked down briefly. His weathered hand rested against the pocket. "Nothing that concerns you." The answer only strengthened Claire's confidence. "Then show everyone." Walter's expression remained unchanged. No, the response was calm, respectful, final. A murmur moved through the crowd. Claire could almost hear the online audience leaning forward. She stepped closer. "You want people to believe your stories, but you do not want them to see the evidence." Walter slowly looked toward the memorial wall again. Sunlight reflected from the engraved names, casting pale streaks across the polished stone. For a moment, he seemed far away, not distracted, remembering something. "Some things are not meant for public display," he said quietly. Claire shook her head. "That sounds convenient." A few people nodded. Others appeared uncomfortable. Near the camera rig, Ben Lawson adjusted a lens and watched the exchange carefully. Unlike Claire, he was no longer focused on the old man's answers. He was watching Walter's eyes. There was something unusual there. Not fear, not embarrassment, something older. The kind of patience that came from carrying a burden for a very long time. Walter took a slow breath. The cool air stirred the collar of his jacket. "Young lady," he said, "you are looking for a story." Claire crossed her arms. "And are you saying I will not find one?" For the first time all afternoon, something almost resembling a smile touched the corner of Walter's mouth. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. "No," he said softly. "I think you already found it." Claire frowned. The answer made no sense. Yet for reasons she could not explain, a chill ran through her despite the mild 62-degree afternoon. And standing a few feet away, Ben Lawson suddenly became very interested in whatever was hidden inside that old wallet. Claire Whitmore sensed the crowd beginning to drift away from certainty, and she could not allow that to happen. Doubt was dangerous to a story. Doubt gave people time to think. She needed momentum. She needed proof. Raising her voice slightly, she turned toward the camera and addressed the thousands watching online. "Let us talk about facts," she said. "For the past 3 weeks, my team has searched every public database available. Military records, newspaper archives, historical registries, veteran organizations. Nothing." She held up a tablet. No documented awards. No public commendations. No interviews. No evidence supporting the stories that have followed Walter Hayes for decades. Several people in the crowd exchanged uncertain glances. The confidence in Claire's voice was persuasive. She had built her reputation on finding inconsistencies others missed. More than once, she had exposed public figures who turned out to be exactly what they claimed not to be. She expected this story to end the same way. Walter remained silent. The old veteran stood beneath the memorial flagpole with the wreath resting against his chest. The wind stirred his silver hair. His expression never changed. Claire found that increasingly frustrating. "Do you know what concerns me?" she asked. "The missing years." That finally caught the crowd's attention. She tapped the screen and displayed a timeline. 11 years. Completely unaccounted for. Not one official record available to the public. Not one verifiable explanation. Murmurs spread across the gathering. Even people who had known Walter for years looked surprised. Claire stepped closer. Most people have a paper trail. Jobs. Addresses. Tax records. Licenses. Something. But somehow, for 11 years, Walter Hayes practically disappears. The camera zoomed tighter. Walter's face remained calm. "Do you have an explanation?" Claire asked. "No," Walter replied. "No," Claire repeated. "Or you will not provide one." Walter looked toward the memorial wall again. Sunlight reflected across the engraved names. Some things belong to the people who lived them. The answer irritated Claire more than she wanted to admit. It sounded less like an excuse and more like a principle. She quickly pushed the feeling aside. "Convenient," she said again. Near the camera platform, Ben Lawson continued watching. Something about the exchange felt wrong. Claire had evidence. Plenty of it. Yet the old man's behavior did not fit the pattern. Every person Ben had ever seen caught in a lie eventually became defensive. Walter Hayes seemed almost sad. Not for himself. For something else. Ben's gaze drifted once more toward the wallet pocket. The silver object remained hidden except for a tiny edge reflecting sunlight. Then he noticed something else. Walter's thumb rested against the pocket unconsciously. Not protecting an item. Remembering it. The distinction sent an unexpected chill through him. Claire continued pressing forward. If the records do not exist, and the evidence does not exist, why should anyone believe the stories? Walter slowly turned his eyes toward her. The crowd quieted. Even the wind seemed to pause. "Because some records were never meant to be found," he said softly. The statement drew scattered laughter from a few spectators. Claire smiled, believing she had finally cornered him. But Ben felt his stomach tighten. The old man had not sounded nervous. He had sounded certain. And for the first time that afternoon, Ben began wondering whether the missing 11 years were not a weakness in Walter Hayes' story at all, but the reason nobody had ever been able to explain it. Claire Whitmore knew she had reached the point where most stories broke open. The crowd was listening. The livestream numbers had doubled. Every eye was fixed on Walter Hayes. All she needed now was one mistake. One contradiction. One piece of evidence she could place in front of him that he could not explain away. Her attention returned once again to the object hidden inside his pocket. The silver edge caught the afternoon sunlight for a fraction of a second. This time she moved before he could shift away. "That coin," she said sharply. "Let everyone see it." The crowd turned toward Walter. A breeze swept across the memorial grounds, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and fallen leaves. Somewhere behind them, the church bells finished another slow chime. Walter looked down at the pocket. His hand rested there for several seconds. "No," he answered. The refusal immediately energized Claire. "Why not?" she pressed. "If it proves your story, show it." Walter's expression remained calm. "It does not prove anything." "Then it is meaningless?" Claire asked. The old veteran looked up. "No." The answer was quiet, but something about it caused several people nearby to fall silent. Claire stepped closer. "Then what is it?" Walter studied the memorial wall again. His eyes moved across the engraved names as though reading something only he could see. "A promise," he said. The answer drew confused looks from the crowd. Claire shook her head and laughed softly. "A promise," she repeated. "That is what you are protecting? A promise." Walter did not respond. The silence frustrated her more than any argument could have. She turned toward the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, after weeks of investigation, we still have no records, no evidence, and now apparently a mysterious coin connected to a promise." A few spectators chuckled. Others seemed uncomfortable. Near the camera rig, Ben Lawson zoomed in as far as the lens allowed. The object was still mostly hidden, but for the briefest instant Walter adjusted his jacket. That was all Ben needed. The camera captured a partial image. A worn silver coin. Scratched. Weathered. Ordinary except for 3 faded markings near the edge. G.L.-7. Ben froze. The letters looked strangely familiar. Not familiar because he had seen them before. Familiar because he had heard them before. Years ago, sitting at a kitchen table late at night. listening to stories his father rarely told. Stories that always stopped the moment certain names appeared. Gray Lantern. The memory hit him like cold water. His father had not spoken those words with excitement. He had spoken them with respect. The kind of respect people reserve for things they did not fully understand. Ben looked up from the monitor. Walter was still standing there calmly, while Claire continued dismantling his reputation piece by piece. Yet suddenly none of Claire's evidence seemed as solid as it had minutes earlier. Ben glanced back at the coin, then at Walter, then back at the letters. A knot formed in his stomach, because for the first time all afternoon, he was no longer wondering whether Walter Hayes was hiding something. He was beginning to wonder who had spent decades making sure nobody could find it. Walter Hayes never looked at the coin when he remembered. He never had to. The weight of it alone was enough. Standing beneath the memorial flagpole, surrounded by cameras and strangers, he felt the familiar shape resting inside his pocket, and for a brief moment the voices around him seemed to fade. The cool Virginia breeze disappeared. The chatter of the crowd vanished. Even Claire Whitmore's questions became distant echoes. In their place came another memory, another sky, another lifetime. He was 27 years old again, standing on a remote airfield thousands of miles from home. The sun hung low over a stretch of cracked pavement. Heat shimmered above the runway. A transport aircraft waited in silence near the far end of the field. There were no reporters, no cameras, no spectators, only a handful of men carrying responsibilities far larger than themselves. Back then, nobody spoke openly about where they were going or why. Certain assignments existed in a strange place between history and secrecy. They happened. They mattered. Then they disappeared from public view. Walter remembered the faces more than the details. Young officers trying to appear confident. Experienced men hiding exhaustion behind humor. One of them stood out above all the others. A tall major with sharp eyes and an easy smile. Thomas McAllister. The future meant nothing to either of them then. He was simply another man carrying a difficult burden. The mission that followed would never appear in newspapers. It would never be discussed in public ceremonies. Yet it would change dozens of lives forever. Walter remembered long nights, endless travel, quiet conversations beneath distant stars. He remembered people relying on one another because there was nobody else to rely on. Trust became more valuable than rank. Character became more important than reputation. And somewhere during those months, Thomas McAllister handed Walter the silver coin. Not as an award, not as recognition, as a promise. The coin had been ordinary even then. Worn edges, scratched surface, nothing remarkable about it. But on one side, barely visible beneath years of wear, were the letters G.L.-7. Gray Lantern 7, a designation known only to a very small number of people. Walter could still hear Thomas's voice. If the day ever comes when nobody believes what happened, keep this anyway. Walter had laughed at the time. The idea seemed impossible. How could anyone forget something so important? How could history simply disappear? Yet decades passed. Records vanished behind locked doors. Names faded from public memory. People moved on. The world changed. And somehow the impossible became reality. Back at the memorial hall, Walter slowly opened his eyes. The crowd remained fixed on him. Claire was still speaking. The live stream continued. But now the coin felt heavier than it had only minutes earlier. Because somewhere deep inside an old memory, he suddenly recalled one more thing Thomas McAllister had said before they parted ways. If anyone ever asks about Gray Lantern, the major had told him, it means somebody important finally started looking. Ben Lawson stepped away from the camera platform before anyone noticed. The sounds of the crowd faded behind him as he moved toward the edge of the parking lot where a row of oak trees cast long shadows across the pavement. His heart was beating faster than it should have been. He kept telling himself there had to be another explanation. 3 faded letters on an old coin did not prove anything. Yet he could not shake the memory. Gray Lantern. The words had lived somewhere in the back of his mind for years, buried beneath ordinary life, until the sight of that coin pulled them back into the light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. For several seconds, he stared at the screen. Then he scrolled to a number he rarely used. His father answered on the 3rd ring. Ben. The older man's voice sounded surprised. Everything okay? Ben glanced back toward the memorial hall. Claire was still speaking into the camera. Walter Hayes still stood calmly beneath the flag. Dad, Ben said quietly, I need to ask you something. There was a brief pause. Go ahead. Have you ever heard the phrase Gray Lantern 7? Silence. Complete silence. The reaction was immediate. Not confusion. Not curiosity. Silence. Ben stopped walking. Dad. The older man finally spoke. His voice had changed. It sounded older somehow. More careful. Where did you hear that? Ben felt a chill run down his spine. So it is real. Another pause followed. Benjamin, his father said slowly. Tell me exactly where you heard those words. Ben explained everything. The live stream. The old veteran. The coin. The faded letters. He described Walter Hayes as accurately as he could. When he finished, the line remained quiet for several long seconds. Then his father released a slow breath. Listen carefully. Do not say those words to anyone else right now. Ben looked toward the crowd again. Why? Because if that coin is genuine, you are standing next to someone very important. Ben frowned. Important how? His father hesitated. Not famous. Not public. Important. The distinction landed heavily. Do you know who Walter Hayes is? Ben asked. No. His father answered honestly. But I know who might. Papers rustled on the other end of the line. A chair scraped across a floor. I am going to make a phone call. To who? Ben asked. An old friend. The answer came immediately. Retired Colonel David Mercer. Ben had heard the name before. Mercer had served in senior military intelligence positions decades earlier. The fact that his father was calling him over an old coin made Ben's stomach tighten. Dad, he said quietly, what exactly was Gray Lantern? The older man exhaled once. That, he replied, is the question nobody ever answered. And before Ben could ask anything else, the call ended. Retired Colonel David Mercer was halfway through a quiet afternoon when his private phone rang. He almost ignored it. Very few people still had that number. Fewer still used it. When he saw the caller identification, he answered immediately. Ben Lawson's father wasted no time. He explained the live stream. The old veteran. The silver coin. The faded letters. Gray Lantern 7. By the time the explanation ended, Mercer was no longer sitting. He stood beside the window of his study staring out at a line of pine, trees moving gently in the wind. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he asked a single question. Are you absolutely certain about the letters? The answer came back instantly. Yes. Mercer closed his eyes. 30 years earlier, he had signed documents that mentioned Gray Lantern only once. Even then, the references had been incomplete. Names were missing. Entire pages had been removed. Yet one detail remained burned into his memory. Gray Lantern was not a unit. It was not a location. It was a designation connected to people whose records had been deliberately separated from ordinary military archives. Mercer reached for another phone resting inside a locked drawer. He had not used it in years. The number he dialed from memory belonged to a former colleague who had retired from Washington only 2 years earlier. The call connected after 2 rings. This had better be important, the voice answered. Mercer looked at the coin photograph that had just arrived on his phone. I think somebody found Gray Lantern 7. Silence followed. Then a sharp intake of breath. That is impossible. I would have said the same thing 30 minutes ago. Another pause. Who found it? Mercer looked at the image again. The worn coin. The scratched letters. The unmistakable markings. I do not know, he admitted. But I know somebody needs to find out. Within minutes another call was placed. Then another. The chain moved quietly through people who rarely spoke about the past. Former officers. Former analysts. Men and women who had spent careers protecting information most Americans never knew existed. Meanwhile, back at the Memorial Hall, Claire Whitmore continued pressing forward. The live stream audience had grown larger than any she had hosted that year. She interpreted the growing attention as validation. She believed the story was working. What she could not see was the invisible reaction unfolding hundreds of miles away. In offices, homes, and secure conference rooms, one name had begun moving from person to person. Walter Hayes. Nobody recognized it at first. Then somebody paired the name with the coin. Then somebody else found an old reference buried inside a restricted archive. The reaction changed immediately. Questions turned into urgency. Urgency turned into phone calls. And somewhere inside Washington, a senior defense official received a brief message containing only 4 words. Gray Lantern 7 identified. The official stared at the screen for several seconds before standing abruptly. Because after decades of silence, a name long forgotten had suddenly returned. Inside a secure conference room in Washington, General Robert McAllister was reviewing briefing documents when an aide entered without knocking. That alone was unusual. The aide's face carried the kind of tension that made experienced officers pay attention. A tablet was placed on the table. No explanation. No introduction. Just a single image displayed on the screen. A worn silver coin. Scratched edges. Faded markings. G.L.-7. For several seconds, the general did not move. Around him, conversations continued. Staff officers discussed schedules. Analysts reviewed reports. None of them noticed the sudden change in his expression. Then he looked up. Where did this come from? The room fell silent. The aide swallowed. A live stream in Virginia, sir. The general stood slowly. Who has the coin? The answer arrived immediately. A civilian veteran named Walter Hayes. The name hit the room like a shockwave nobody could see. McAllister stared at the screen. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in decades. Yet he knew it instantly. Not because Walter Hayes had been famous. Not because his story appeared in history books. Quite the opposite. Walter Hayes belonged to a category of people whose names were rarely mentioned at all. Men who had carried responsibilities quietly and then returned home without recognition. The general reached for the tablet with both hands. His eyes never left the image. Around the conference table, several senior officials exchanged confused looks. One finally spoke. Sir, should we be concerned? McAllister's answer came without hesitation. Very. Back in Millbrook, Claire Whitmore sensed victory approaching. The crowd had become restless. Some believed her. Others did not. But the uncertainty itself was feeding the story. Walter Hayes remained standing beneath the flagpole, calm as ever. The wreath still rested against his chest. The old veteran looked less like a man under pressure and more like a man waiting for a train that happened to be running late. Claire found that deeply irritating. You still have not provided a single piece of evidence, she said. Not one. Walter looked toward the Memorial Hall entrance where families continued arriving. That is because I did not come here to prove anything. The answer triggered another wave of whispers. Nearby, Ben Lawson returned to the camera platform. His phone felt unusually heavy in his pocket. Since speaking with his father, 3 separate calls had arrived from numbers he did not recognize. Every caller had asked the same question. Is the veteran still there? Is the coin still visible? Nobody asked whether the story was true. Nobody questioned the markings. That frightened him more than anything else. Then Claire's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen and dismissed the call without looking. Seconds later it rang again. Another unknown number. She ignored it. Then it rang a third time. The expression on Ben's face changed immediately. Because the caller identification was no longer hidden. It displayed a government exchange code he recognized from his father's old contacts. And hundreds of miles away, General Robert McAllister had just issued a direct order. Get me that reporter. Right now. Claire Whitmore stared at her phone as it vibrated for the 4th time. The crowd watched. The livestream audience watched. Even the wind seemed to pause. She almost ignored the call again. Then she noticed Ben Lawson's expression. The young cameraman had gone pale. Claire, he said quietly, you should answer that. Something in his voice made her hesitate. Slowly, she accepted the call and placed it on speaker. Claire Whitmore speaking. For a moment, there was only static. Then a calm, professional voice filled the memorial grounds. This is General Robert McAllister, United States Department of Defense. Every conversation stopped instantly. Claire's confident smile faltered. She glanced at the camera, then at the crowd, then at Walter Hayes. The old veteran did not react. He simply stood beneath the flagpole holding the wreath. General, Claire said carefully, to what do I owe the pleasure? The answer came immediately. I understand you are currently interviewing a man named Walter Hayes. Claire swallowed. That is correct. Another brief silence followed. Not uncertainty. Deliberation. The kind that carried weight. Miss Whitmore, the general said, I strongly advise you to listen carefully to what I am about to say. The crowd leaned forward. Phones remained frozen and raised hands. Even the live stream comment feed slowed as viewers realized something unusual was happening. Walter Hayes is not a fraud, the general continued. He is not a storyteller. He is not a man seeking recognition. In fact, he spent most of his life avoiding it. Claire felt the ground shifting beneath her. General, are you saying these stories are true? The response came without hesitation. No, I am saying the public stories do not even begin to tell the truth. A ripple passed through the crowd. Walter lowered his eyes slightly. The silver coin remained hidden inside his pocket. Sir, Claire asked, struggling to regain control. How do you know this? For the first time, emotion entered the general's voice. Because my father knew him. The memorial grounds fell silent. Thomas McAllister spent the rest of his life speaking about duty, integrity, and quiet courage. Whenever he was asked where he learned those lessons, he always mentioned one man. Walter Hayes. Claire stared across the gathering toward the old veteran. The same quiet man she had spent the afternoon trying to expose. The same man who had never once defended himself. Miss Whitmore, the general said. There are records concerning Walter Hayes that remain outside public archives for reasons that are not mine to discuss. But I can tell you this. If that man is standing in front of you today, then you are standing in the presence of someone who earned the respect of people whose names most Americans will never know. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Walter finally took a slow step forward. He walked past the cameras, past the microphones, past the crowd. Then he knelt beside the memorial wall and carefully placed the wreath beneath the engraved names of old friends. The phone call ended. The live stream continued. Yet nobody seemed interested in the reporter anymore. Every eye followed the old veteran instead. And for the first time all afternoon, Claire Whitmore realized she had not uncovered a lie. She had uncovered a silence that had lasted more than 50 years.